All right, let's move on.
We should.
It's to bed. And we're actually got an article that we just actually wrapped up that we're publishing today. And this doesn't actually have to deal directly with AI, but again, could. But we're going to talk about Heroku and Mulesoft, better application development. We did talk about how Heroku's better together with Mulesoft, how Mulesoft enhances Heroku's features. This is the reverse, effectively. It's kind of like similar ground that we treaded on, but effectively, the highlight here is Mulesoft make application development on Heroku even better. Accessible. So we've talked about the reverse. We're going to talk about this, why each perspective is important, and why are these two things together? Because it's like, well, Heroku does APIs. Like, why do I need to also have MuleSoft do API? I don't get it. Like, which isn't it the same thing? Which, frankly, we've talked to some technical architects at Salesforce who think that, and they're wrong. And so we're going to walk them through and walk everyone else through. It's like, hey, this is how these two things really, and I hate to use the word, but I will, synergize together. So Justin, since you authored this one, this is your baby.
Yes.
Why don't you take it away and
I'm excited.
Walk us through it.
Yeah. So taking the table setting that Mike's already given us here, I actually even want to take one step back from Heroku for a second, because the advantage here is really tied to traditional web development. So if we think about your favorite technology stack, the mean stack, or maybe it's RadialSpark's plan stack. It's a pretty cool stack too. In there, you have a back-end framework you're working with. Express for mean, loopback for plan. And then in both cases, your front-end framework is going to be Angular. Now, your Angular framework is designed to deliver your front-end application. So it's going to also deliver a front-end API for the complex interactions inside of the UI of that application. Your back-end framework, Express or loopback, that's going to provide your data access API. You're like, oh, here's my data model. I need CRUD endpoints for all of it. Let me set that up. When you're just looking at those tech stacks, there's a momentary like, now hold on, isn't there kind of a gap here? Because if Express is making an API to access the data and Angular is making an API to access like front-end interactions and facilitate complicated processes, but they're not the same API. They don't talk to each other. So how does this work? And like the simple answer is you might build some shared Angular services that then consume your Express or loopback backend API to be able to access and interface with your backend data, which is fine, but it means a few things. It means one, you can update your front end without updating your backend, but you can't update your backend without updating your front end, because the consuming client code for your backend API is actually part of your Angular app. And normally when you deploy something like this on Heroku, which is where we're bringing back to Heroku, you end up having like two apps that you deploy to Heroku. Your Angular app, which is responsible for serving the application and serving the API, the front-end API that interfaces with that application. And then you have your back-end app, which would have your, maybe a Postgres database and your loopback API and the data access controls through that API for the data in your Postgres. That Angular app then has code that consumes your backend app's API. Every time you update the backend app's API, you also have to update your front end. So it's a little brittle. They're a little closely coupled. And quite frankly, it's all still custom coded, which I don't entirely love. So in my mind, this is something for a long time I've been like, what is the best way to do this? And when we first started the Better Together series, because the very first article I ever wrote was the article that was the inverse of this. How does Heroku make MuleSoft better? And I kind of had this aha moment where I was like, oh, I'm kind of an idiot. Why didn't I think of this? MuleSoft process APIs are designed to live between front-end experience APIs and back-end system APIs. That should be the glue that ties your two different Heroku apps, front-end and back-end, together. And by doing that, it means that everything else you've connected through MuleSoft, all your other system APIs for existing IT structures, all of that, those process APIs can be used by your Angular Experience API to surface data across multiple systems. So you get a looser coupling by inserting MuleSoft into the middle. You're getting maximum mileage from your developers by using the development artifacts that are already created by the frameworks they're familiar with: Angular, Vue, React, Express, Loopback. So you're basically saying, hey, apparently, before anybody actually consciously thought about this, we've already pretty well understood how to develop experience and system APIs. Process APIs haven't necessarily been a thing prominent in traditional web development. Mulesoft can bring that to the table, and with it, bring that interconnectedness to all your other systems, to all your other things, as well as that loose coupling. And additionally, because you're then taking your, let's say, your new application API that you've made on Heroku for this new app you've delivered, by consuming that through a Mulesoft Process API, that is now also available to all of your other existing Mulesoft connected systems. So you have launched a new product that can reuse all your existing IT connections and integrations, and all the data that is now being sourced or driven on this new product is now available to all your existing IT connected, integrations through Mulesoft. So very powerful stuff right there, just right on the tip of it. But the other thing that then stems from that realization is this: new product development or new experience development in and of itself can now be seen as like an incremental endeavor. There's no longer I need to develop this external facing customer experience, so I need to migrate all of my customer data from Salesforce or my ERP or wherever into a backend application database so that my application knows who my customers are and I can build a user system on top of that. You can build a user system that accesses the data that's already in the other systems. So now your new application development is actually strictly just focused on what are those things that don't actually exist anywhere else in your IT. You are constantly creating new rather than trying to transpose or rebuild stuff you already have in a place that's convenient for the new app. And that in and of itself is a huge DevOps efficiency boost. It's crazy. I can't overstate like how powerful that concept is. I'll take a second to stop, because if I don't, no one will be able to stop me. So Mike or Peyton, man in the back yelling everyone attack, you guys have questions about what I've said there? Is there something you want me to dig into a little further?
Well, I'm thinking like you go to number 4 when you, in the article where you're talking about stitching together Heroku apps while optimizing Mulesoft. So like the interesting thing that you mentioned, it's like that brittle, tightly coupled, like, because you like normally if you're in the Heroku sphere, like you've got your web dyno and you've got your backend API dyno or whatever. They're totally separate. Like, one's for your front end, one's for your back end, one's for your database, one's for your process,
Exactly.
And so when you bolt Mulesoft in here, now Mulesoft is still tightly coupled, but like from your standpoint, and I think we've talked about this too, it's like that whole, and again, I wish I had a screenshot. We should update the article to include one. Just the ability to orchestrate those APIs in a WYSIWYG way. I think it really, without having to like completely recode whole files.
If you don't mind me walking through an example, I'm totally happy to.
Yeah. Like, I think what's a specific business level example that it's like, why do I care? It's like,
let's talk about that customer data for a second. So any new experience you build, right, is going to have a user system. You're logging in, you're like, hey, it's an app. My app has users. So for each new app you roll out, you're going to have some kind of database that stores the users and their current status with that app. Are they allowed to log in? When was the last time they logged in? Things like that. With this idea of like constantly doing incremental development and like being additive and tying into what you were talking about, like this orchestration layer that's brilliant. When you want to access like robust customer data related to a user, like all you might need is like one identifier in the user table for your application that's like, here's their customer ID. And then your process APIs in Mulesoft, it's like, oh, we're authenticating a request. So this comes into the experience. It goes through, let's say, a user process API that's validating them against the user database, saying, okay, this is a real person. But it also grabs that, like, maybe it's a contact ID from Salesforce, just to have a concrete example. That's the only piece of data from Salesforce, just one ID on the user saying, hey, this user is this contact. That gets sent back up to the Mulesoft Process API, which then has a follow-on request that's going to Salesforce. It's like, by the way, I want this supporting information about the user. Like maybe your app's user table is just an email address and like their authentication stuff. It's like, give me their first name, their last name, give me their address, give me their phone number. I'm putting this up in the UI. And it could be something that you're surfacing like a profile page in your app for them to edit their details. And then they edit the details in your app, but that's actually pushing the change back to your Salesforce where that data was sourced from. So having that like orchestration layer, which really shines in the process layer of the API architecture, where it's like, oh, I'm authenticating against a user. I'm grabbing a simple like identifier for this person off of my application database and then querying some key information from other existing IT systems to flesh out my understanding of who this person is beyond just a user. And then maybe even letting them manipulate that data and push that data back into the systems it was sourced from. That's nuts. That's crazy in my mind.
Well, and I think to really break that down is that the cool thing that I see from like an optimization standpoint is, like you mentioned, to build off the topic you originally talked about, that brittleness and tightly coupled, because we've had Mulesoft in between. Like if we wanted to add that functionality into your app,
like already existing,
you don't need to also update both ends of your app. All you need to do is add that workflow. It depending on how you structure your app, right? Like it depends. But if you can already accept that JSON file as an example, if already it's like, hey, I'm just getting a new field in here and I'm throwing it in this HTML table, you literally don't have to push a new change for your web app. You know, for your web dino, you don't need to push a new web app update, push a new system app update. You're literally just changing Mulesoft and adding that orchestration and enriching your data without having to do all that other DevOps.
So like really simple, really stupid example for that. Now that I understand where you wanted me to go there, like let's assume like you have your app and you're like, hey, we just authenticate and we take them to a homepage. And then somebody's like, you know what? We want this to be a more intimate personal experience. So when we log in, we're going to have a splash screen that says hi and like identifies them by their first name. And you're like, oh, well, our user database for the app, we're not keeping their names. It's just email authentication stuff, whatever. I don't have that. Because you have the Mulesoft process API, basically somebody goes into your front end, your Angular app, they're adding this like hello screen, but then you go into your Mulesoft process and you say, hey, when I authenticate this user, I'm going to grab that contact ID as part of my request for the authentication. I'm going to go hit an existing Salesforce system API that I already have. And I'm going to say, hey, give me the first name for this contact. Here's the ID. And then you just surface that back. And because it's coming back into the response and back into the experience API, the front end guy's just like, this is where it's located. Boom, that's it is. So you make your update to your front end to add whatever feature it is. And then you can make an update to your process layer to pull in that data piece you need that's not part of this app, but is available somewhere else. It's a small add to an existing call.
Yeah, and I think the thing is that you're literally cutting down the number of application updates that you have to do in this particular use case by half. Like you still have to update
code on the front end because Mulesoft's
it's all point. Yeah, so it's all point and click on the Mulesoft side. So you're not coding both sides of the app. You're just coding the front end of the app. And you're like, hey, go get this, and then you do the WYSIWYG to service data. And I think that's the key focus of like how this makes, because a lot of people struggle, especially like, and the article we're gonna be coming out with next week is talking about like the delta between, or the differences between Heroku communities and Experience Cloud as an example. When to use what? And people struggle with that because they're, oh, Lightning Web App Builder, like, yeah, you can code. A lot of it's point and click, WYSIWYG. Like, I understand that as a business user. This takes the fidelity and the flexibility you have with custom developed applications that you host on Heroku and adds the most complicated piece, which is your API. Like, that's the most complicated thing you need to get right, and turns that into a mostly WYSIWYG process. There's still system level APIs you need to develop and code. A lot of the frameworks we use have self-documenting APIs. There's still some code that needs to happen. So again, it's just continuing to move that ball to make that more accessible. So when you have a business use case that comes up and says, hey, I want to add a splash screen, or hey, I need to enrich my data. I need to add, we just bought this other company and we want to pull their data from over here from this line of business, and we want to incorporate that into this page. And you're like, well, crap. Okay, so now I got to get that data into my backend system for the app so it knows who that is. No, we don't need to do that. We're like, hey, we've got, go update the front end, go add the place where the data is going to live, add it to your HTML table, make it look nice. And MuleSoft it's the same endpoint. You're calling this is the same call that you're getting all this data from, and MuleSoft's just going to enrich the data.
Yeah, it's going to.
And I'm going to do that through all point and click. And I think that's the thing. It's like, oh wait, I could just consume this new source and then add this to this existing call and then enrich my custom developed apps. I think that's a thing that people are, again, it continues to close the gap of like the level of difficulty that people perceive with Heroku coming from the Salesforce world when building custom apps.
100%. And it's one of the things I'm most excited about. And the other thing I like about this approach, and this might get me a slap on the wrist from the MuleSoft people because it's, cost efficiency, is the idea that, like, especially if you are a smaller scale business looking to adopt MuleSoft in the early stages, like MuleSoft has made some great strides to make themselves more accessible down market. They have pricing now based on effectively like flow executions and messages, which is effectively like how many different flows are you going to need? How many requests are you pushing through them? If you're doing an implementation like this, where your system APIs or APIs generated by traditional web frameworks, your experience APIs or APIs generated by traditional front-end frameworks, then your MuleSoft implementation's at the process layer. And you're going to be consuming multiple system APIs and bringing it in, so you will still be consuming those resources, but you're consolidating your usage of those paid for resources at your process layer to achieve the interconnectivity, which is at the heart of MuleSoft's value proposition. So this kind of approach also helps you, like, if you're trying to stretch and bring MuleSoft into your tech to deliver on a vision like this, but you're cost conscious, using your internal IT's experience and the frameworks they know, this lets you stretch your MuleSoft farther and get more out of it to really sell that core of MuleSoft's value proposition.
Well, I mean, again, like Salesforce could slap you on the wrist and on the face for being a Heroku and MuleSoft evangelist here. Like, but again, like, we don't get commission checks. So like, we're here to support our customers and our partners to maximize the usage of the tools that they purchase from Salesforce. I'm hoping after this discussion, they're looking at getting more customers and be like, oh, well, we didn't get as many APIs. You know what I mean? So I think we're covered, Justin. I think you'll get a different slap.
I am okay
a
with
high
a
five
slap on the back or a high
there
five.
You go.
I'll be honest. So those are the aspects of this article. And again, I'm trying not to like completely rehash it for those of you who will read it in your downtime. But those are like the key points, like the banner takeaways for how powerful and how crazy cool this kind of an architecture is. And honestly, in a way where some people think like, oh, traditional API development or MuleSoft. And again, I like to be the 5-year-old asking, why not both? And there's a really niche need here that traditional web development has that MuleSoft fills that plays to its core strength, which to me is like a profound synergy. And I can't believe it's not more heavily marketed.